And good morning. It's Patrick Lovell coming to you on Thursday, February 15th, 2024 at approximately 9:15 a.m. my time and 10:15 a.m. Eastern Standard Time from the great city of Miami, where my good friend Bruce Jacobs is coming back into the conversation. Bruce, you're a sight for sore eyes. I miss you, and I'm so excited to talk to you, given all that's going on. But I want to introduce this is kind of a kind of a setting the table. This past week, we've seen again um, revelations of corruption at the Supreme Court. The nature of what I saw on display from the arguments of the constitutional 14th Amendment, Section 3, and the arguments that were laid out were so unbelievably obvious for all to see, particularly given who these court justices are and what their backgrounds are. And there's been a lot of news in different places of the media. I mean, it has reached the mainstream, but we've seen, stemming primarily from Justice Clarence Thomas, and of course his involvement with his wife Jenny Thomas, and her involvement with Koch Foundation, and of course, all things the insurrection, as well as what it related to on that day on January 6th, is just one piece of much broader story involving billionaires such as Harlan Crow from Dallas, the real estate billionaire, and Leonard Leo, the hedge fund billionaire, and of course, Justice Alito and Kavanaugh and all of the rest. And it's like, okay, wait a second. Let me just hit the pause here in the rewind just to read what the 14th Amendment says, just really quick, just to kind of set the tone for this conversation. Section 14th Amendment, Section 3, disqualifies someone from holding office. No person shall be a senator or representative in Congress or elector of the president or president or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States or under any state who, having previously taken an oath as a member of Congress or as an officer of the United States or as a member of state legislature or as an executive or a judicial officer of any state to support the Constitution of the United States, shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same, or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. But Congress may be, by a vote of 2/3 of each house, remove such disability. Now, this isn't a discussion about the 14th Amendment, Section 3. It's to set up the idea that we have massive corruption at in the highest court of the United States. And we all saw the insurrection. We all saw the January 6th activities. Anybody paying attention to what took place prior to January 6th understood that this was hatched, it was planned, it was orchestrated, it was operated, it was funded. There was so many different elements that have yet to be answered. And then the justices in this discussion did not actually focus on the elements of what we actually saw. They focused on hypotheticals, on many other things. They played tricks of cherry picking of elements of what those who'd actually won a civil war at great expense and tragedy to the United States of blood and treasure that they obviously weren't a part of, and yet they're acting as if didn't happen and didn't understand the historical context. Anyway, again, it's just a sort of contextualization to suggest that if you think that it's insane that corruption has landed in the Supreme Court, what then might we discern could be a possibility in courts around the country where no one's looking? Now, I only say that not to ask you a direct question to suggest that are the courts corrupt. What I want to do is hit the rewind on what we know you've unfortunately had to contend with for over a decade. I think we're approaching 14 years. You were a former prosecutor in Miami. You became a defense attorney for foreclosure defense. And I have watched you participate in some of the most extraordinary um, discussions in court where you present discovery, you present unbelievably lock, stock, and barrel evidence in cases that are dismissed summarily by judges that cherry pick certain elements of what enables the perversion of what the intent of the judicial system is supposed to achieve. And I have been on this journey for 13 years, and I have yet to meet a more courageous attorney in my experience. And I've met hundreds, and I've met hundreds of people that are victims of corporate fraud and that have the most beguiling, um, easy to coordinate and understand the elements that went into a criminal apparatchik, that the judges are literally having blinds over their eyes. They're not listening, and they won't speak truth to the actual crime that you've been in the midst of for a ridiculous amount of time, to a point that it's had some direct impact on your career and your life and your family, and yet you're still standing in a way that is justice. And there you are in front of the Supreme Court. So it goes without saying. These are the principles by which the former, Eagle Scout, and team leader for Boy Scouts and everything that you exemplify in your life, Bruce, is the courage and the professionalism and the wherewithal to fight for justice on behalf of the American people. And people like you exist. They're few and far between. But I want to open up this dialogue with that perspective, just to kind of dive into a broad-based question to start, and then we can narrow in. What is happening with you today? What is the latest? And then let's backfill what we need to understand, so that someone who is new to this, which is extraordinary, but I run into this all the time, people still have no idea what's happened in this country to a degree that's literally impacted tens of millions of people. Start us off.
So thank you for having me, for starters. Look, I have been practicing law 25 years, and I went to Fordham Law School in Manhattan. I learned how to try cases as a prosecutor here in Miami. I understand the system. And what I'm most concerned about is the system breaking down, right? Like, think about the absurdity of a discussion at the U.S. Supreme Court about the events of January 6th and whether that we should or should not allow people involved in insurrection to keep trying to take control of the government. And what are we hearing every day? That they're already planning to oust all the people that blocked them last time, that this is you're either with us or you're against us. And they're going for the golden ring. They want, and who are they? I don't know, a bunch of very, very wealthy people who want a bunch of very, very Christian nationalist people to join with a bunch of very, very willing participants to take the government for themselves.
Absolutely.
Like, that is what you were talking about from the Civil War, and even before that, from the American Revolution. Like, the idea was, we are not going to have an elite class that is going to stand above all of us, live by a different set of laws, and we're going to just be their servants, because that doesn't work in America. That works in Russia, in China, in North Korea, and all these places that we would never want to live, because you walk out your door and your neighbors are trained to try to get you in trouble to make their lives better.
That's right.
Because everyone's lives are terrible.
That's right.
So if you understand the way the founding fathers really set up this idea of checks and balances, and that the Congress is supposed to be looking at the courts, and the courts supposed to be looking at the executive, and the executive is supposed to be looking at the Congress.
Separation of powers. Yep.
Like, there's a reason why everyone swears an oath in the Constitution. Article 6, my favorite article, the Constitution says you must swear an oath to protect and defend the Constitution. But what happens when you have this opening of a door that says money is speech?
That's right.
Right? Citizens United, from what has it been, 30 years, 20 years, however long it's been now. And now what you're seeing is, to get a seat of power anywhere in the government, is a lot of money. Most people don't have it, right? So then all the people with it are bringing in who's the next guy that I can put up. And what have they done? They've set up this ridiculous red, blue, us, them, white, black, whatever the hell you want to, the yin yang, whatever it is that we're supposed to be fighting against each other. And meanwhile, who's helping the people? Like, do we really, I ask this question over and over. Trump people, Bernie people, Biden people, whoever it is, not, independent people, do you think the government has established justice today? No. Have they ensured domestic tranquility? No. Are they providing for the common defense? Not really. What about, do they promote the general welfare? This is the preamble of the Constitution, and nobody seems to be following it, right? And it makes sense that now we have court systems that, look, to me, the idea that we're not all taking up arms about the fact that there is a very powerful movement that almost took the government by force, that is now the leading Republican candidate to take the government again. And even if they lose, which I imagine there's a bunch of people who are not willing to, vote in a dictatorship and vote away their constitutional rights. But I don't think it matters, because we're not even fighting the coming war, which is going to be, they don't care about any of this. The courts are not fair and impartial as far as they're concerned, right? Everything that we're seeing today is geared up for this takeover of the government. And who's really funding it? I bet you Chase and Bank of America are behind a lot of it.
Absolutely.
You know,
The
and
financial system that props up the billionaires, because I say this a lot, billionaires spend billions to loot trillions, and corruption births and fuels fascism. So on that note, I mean, look, what you just said though was such a beautiful lead in, because it's like what Americans have to understand, they have to hear from you directly. The Supreme Court just made this absurd argument that didn't even focus on the constitutional amendment section 3. They didn't even deal with it. They didn't even deal with what we were looking at. They didn't expand the dialogue. They were looking for ways out of describing what we all saw, right? Which is just, again, cherry picking and this maneuverability of justices, which we put in positions for their entire lives until they retire or die, right? I mean, that's as close to, a aristocratic sort of an appointment that we have in our country. But the idea is you want supposedly the fairest, best umpires of our system with the most knowledge, but with the best common sense to operate. And you brought up the most important part here. For a government of, by, and for the people, what you're revealing here, Bruce, is a government of, by, and for the corruption. And so given that, let me tee up this little idea for you, and then maybe you can take it to your personal story. My jaw hit the floor, and it hits the floor every night because of all of the obfuscational lies that we see every night in mainstream media, and then all of the idiots in independent media that have no idea how anything works. But Rachel Maddow, for example, discovers, and I think she is supposed to be the first person that brought to the country's attention, I believe, at least her team. I'm not so sure about it, but they discovered the electoral certification fraud scheme, i.e., what the elector scheme in Trump's attempt to steal the election using fake electors and documentation fraud in the states that involved a racketeering enterprise. And Rachel Maddow is very crystal clear to her audience of millions of people a night that this happened, that this is a possibility. But yet she has never once explored what you've been in the midst of for now over a decade, which is incredible documentation fraud on mortgages, as not just by people. We could talk about all of the different mortgage fraud that led to people getting loans that they should never have gotten. That's one aspect of it. But the other aspect of it are people that got loans that they didn't understand that they were getting into, that were lied through this entire apparatus, this paradigm, this assembly line of fraud, that then in the end, when it blew up for tens of millions of people, would wind up back in the courts where what we call the foreclosure mills, attorneys, literally attorneys, were involved, being hired by what we call servicers to literally lie on documentation fraud that you've seen in many, many, many cases, that I've seen in thousands of cases, that have happened presumably in millions of cases around the country, to where there was a formula that followed that Rachel Maddow doesn't have a clue about. In what world is that possible?
So let me say like this, right? Like, let's start from the idea of the 14th Amendment. What does it say? It says equal justice under law. That's what it says right here on the facade of the Supreme Court, equal justice under law, which means if a bank is committing a crime, they get punished just like if a person's committing a crime, right? And what we're seeing now is a breakdown, right? How does corruption fester and boil and grow? Because of a lack of accountability, right? Because nobody will prosecute it, right? Cop didn't see it, I didn't do it. And what we're seeing today is, at least in Miami, like I am amazed at so we have the city attorney of Miami, a woman named Vicky Mendez, whose husband was exposed for buying properties out of the city of Miami's guardianship program. So people who are literally like in comas and vegetative states and have to sell their homes in order to pay for their care, the city attorney's husband would buy those homes at a discount, get all the city liens cleared, and then flip the homes for sometimes 6 figures in a day.
That is disgusting.
And nobody, and no, and this is like front page news, and everyone's talking about it. You had this guy Billy Corbin, who's like a Miami filmmaker and activist, who filed a bar complaint with the Florida bar, and everyone's still going along like nothing happened.
My God.
Right? You have the City of Miami Commission. You had Commissioner Joe Carroyo was hit with a $63 million civil rights violation judgment. They just they're selling his house right now. And why? Because he used the tools of government to punish people who didn't like him and were trying to get him out of office.
Wow.
Ball and Chain is the name of the bar that had all kinds of inspectors and code violation people like showing up all the time. And it was all because they were funding the Carroyo's opponent. So if you would think if a $63 million civil rights violation comes down from federal court, civil rights is civil and criminal, right? It's a criminal act to deprive someone of their constitutional rights under color of law. But nobody arrested Joe Carroyo. You had Alex Diaz de la Portilla, another Miami commissioner, who actually at one point got a resolution passed calling for the federal government to investigate the fraudulent foreclosures that I was working on, because there was a Cuban lady who spent 19 years in Castro's prison who got thrown out of her home by a fraudulent foreclosure. We took an appeal all the way up, and everyone basically said, no, don't worry. There's no worry that there's any bias against your lawyer or against you. You'll get treated fairly in our court system. The Florida Supreme Court, unanimously, just without even an explanation, denied. Third DCA is on your case, and then they dismissed her case and evicted her, saying she had a claim for money damages, and then dismissed her appeal after they struck her claim for money damages. Right? So Alex Diaz de la Portilla got busted because somebody filed a civil RICO claim saying he's shaking us down for money. He wanted to make his person a partner in a marina on Key Biscayne.
Wow.
It was one of these like, be ashamed if something happened to your marina. Maybe you should let my guy become your partner, and then we'll make sure it's safe. That's mob stuff.
Right.
Right?
Exactly.
What ends up happening is he comes out talking about how this is all, he's a Trump supporter. That's why they're after him.
Yeah.
But he gets replaced by a commissioner named Sabina Kovo, who wins the special election, takes over the seat for 11 months, 7 months, whatever it was, then runs for re-election on the I'm the anti-corruption person.
Yeah.
Except for she's running around doing events with Carollo like they're buddies. And now the the, the election is over, and a guy named Damian Pardo won. And Damian Pardo is actually fighting corruption, and he was someone who's been putting in the effort. And it turns out that Sabina Kovo, in order to try to win the runoff election, was offering no-show jobs to her adversaries who lost in the original election to see if they would endorse her. And now there's a whole investigation about that corruption, right? And that's just in a 5-person body of the Miami City Commission.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable.
Right.
And there's so much more, of course.
And nobody's arrested. Well, I guess Alex Diaz de la Portilla is, but he was arrested because he said it'd be a terrible thing what happened to your marina. Like, that's something I guess people should be upset about. But what we're dealing with today, is a breakdown in people who swore the oath, in my opinion, right? And it is easy. It is so easy to avoid holding anyone accountable if you don't want to. I mean, even if the law says you have to. Let me give you a perfect example of where we are today, right? Today. So I want to tell you about a client I have named Hugo Morales and his wife, Lisa. Hugo came to us he was in foreclosure that had started in like 2013, right? And we got involved in, I think, like 2015. And what had happened was Hugo was a very successful businessman here, and he lived in Bal Harbor, Florida, a very, upscale neighborhood. He had a daughter that became a prosecutor, that grew up to be a prosecutor, a son that became a federal prosecutor, I think. Like, they were a good family, right? And Hugo had a mortgage. It was a $1.25 million mortgage that he had paid down to 1.18 when all of a sudden his whole world took a huge shift because he had a business partner that took millions from him.
Oh.
And it forced him into bankruptcy. So he went into bankruptcy, but he knew he was going to save his house. He was never going to, he did what he had to do. He got back on his horse. He worked his tail off. He was able to make money. He was able to, get help. He should have been helped. And he called Bank of America and said, hey, I need help. I can't pay the mortgage. I need a modification. Please help me. And their answer was, you got to stop paying. We're not going to do anything. We know this whole story about the theft of millions of dollars. You're in bankruptcy, all that. We can't talk about any of that until you stop paying, which is what they told everybody.
Right.
Back in,
All
right?
over the country.
Because once you stop paying, they go into a default servicing mode, and they can make thousands and thousands of dollars per file that they weren't making when you were performing, right? So they had a financial incentive to get you to default. It made them more money. So then what happens? Well, he defaults, he sends in the paperwork, and they sue him for foreclosure without helping him. 2 years into the foreclosure, he sends a letter to the court saying, I have been trying for years now. They won't talk to me. Somebody please help me. And nobody helps him. So he comes to my firm. Because at that time, my old law partner, a guy named Court Keeley, who was a prosecutor with me, I think I was there a little bit before him, but he was a prosecutor here in Miami too, and one of my best friends. And we were partners for years. And we were doing like high level foreclosure defense and consumer protection work for years. Like, we were one of the top firms in the country for this stuff. We were known. We had gotten all kinds of orders from all kinds of judges over years, starting criminal contempt against the banks and their lawyers, calling out bad faith discovery, calling out perjury, calling out dishonest behavior. Right.
And can you hold on 1 second there? I gotta ask you this, because you just introduced a motherload of information. Please just give us a little bit of a detail on each one of those. Can you give us an example of each element? Because I know you've seen this in tens of thousands of situations. Just give us like one example for each one. Documentation fraud in the
I'll
discovery
give you
process, perjury.
there's basically four things that I think people should go to prison for. Otherwise, they'll never stop doing it. And the bank should have to pay money into the city of Miami's foreclosure sanctions affordable housing trust fund. Right? That is a fund that we had set up with the commission. Alex Diaz de la Portilla, Ken Russell, all these people were supportive of the work for years. Right? And if there were a judge to impose sanctions against a bank for any of the things I'm about to tell you they're doing, the money would be put into this fund and it would be used to build affordable housing across Florida.
Smart, unbelievable
What
solution.
and it's totally consistent with federal law. It's totally consistent with the idea of the Constitution. It's consistent with justice, right? And Miami happens to be in the worst affordable housing crisis. We're the epicenter of the national affordable housing crisis. Like we were the epicenter of the national foreclosure fraud crisis, like we were the epicenter of the subprime mortgage crisis. It came here, why? Because you have millions and millions of people of color. The city of Miami sued and
And
won at the US Supreme Court. They won a case against Bank of America saying, you guys, these countrywide loans were a decade-long pattern of discriminatory behavior, where you were charging them up ridiculous fees and giving them all these, teaser rates and all this other stuff that was designed to make them get into the loans. And then when things went south, you were discriminating against them. You wouldn't give modifications. You wouldn't let them refinance. And ultimately, you foreclosed on the minority communities much faster than everyone else.
when was that judgment?
That was the US Supreme Court
No,
decision.
when?
When? Give me a second. I'll pull it up for you. It was only a couple of years ago, right? Like this was
That was an
the
acknowledgement that all this happened. Did they say in the discovery all of the elements that we have? Did that?
was this like that case ended up getting back to federal court and it died because they said, all right, well, but we're only going to let you sue Bank of America
Oh,
for the Bank of America loans. You're not going to be able to sue the countrywide loans that they're doing this on.
okay. God, oh.
But the bottom line still comes down to, look, when you have a situation going like what I've seen in my work, right, is fraud, straight up, old fashioned fraud. They have every right to foreclose on these loans, but do they have a right to use fraud to do it? That's the question, right? No. If the courts say they do, they do, right? And that's the issue we're dealing
Okay.
with.
So give us some examples, though. That's what I'm
All
trying.
right, one example, okay? We know from the $25 billion national mortgage settlement in 2012, the 2011 OCC consent order, Office of the Control of the Currency, they're the federal regulators for the banks. We know from the FBI, we know from the Florida Attorney General's office that a decade ago, there was something called the robo-signing scandal, where there's a company called LPS, Lender Processing Services, now Black Knight Financial, sold millions of false and fictitious mortgage assignments to the banks, who then recorded them in the public records and then presented them as evidence in court. And it was all bogus. It was all rank fraud.
Can you address this one key, because this is a key consideration that the public needs to be aware of. In that
Yeah.
decision, the point is that the people that are signing off on the let's call them the vice presidents of the banks that are signing off on these foreclosure processes, they had to have personal knowledge of all of the elements that
Let me say that that's the whitewash. The truth is, LPS had a company called DocX that had hundreds of thousands of mortgage assignments. The assignment is taken from this person and given to that person who now can come in and foreclose. And it was all fraudulent. It was all bogus. And
they used
they
a name called bogus assignee was one of the signatures.
Right.
Talk about the documentation fraud by the
Like
people.
all of that was like, imagine you have a pool of 1 million loans, right? And they're all in the name of Countrywide. And Countrywide doesn't exist anymore. And now you're going to come in as Bank of New York Mellon, you're going to foreclose on all of these Countrywide loans because you bought, you securitized them and made billions of dollars, crashing the economy while you were betting against it, telling everyone these are AAA rated mortgage-backed securities when they're filled with garbage, right? That whole big short story, right? So now you come to court, and the law was changed in 2001. They said an assignment of mortgage is a secured transaction. And there's uniform commercial code law stuff that's super complicated. But the bottom line is they were supposed to come with contracts to say, here's the note, here's my contract, shows I bought the note. Now you meet the standard across the country, which is that you own and hold the note and mortgage, and you have standing to foreclose.
This is the foreclosing party, yeah.
Right? So this was what they were supposed to be doing. And instead, what they did was, well, first they said, well, MERS is the owner and holder of all these notes. MERS is this mortgage electronic registration system. It's a Wikipedia of land records that they created that is totally worthless. They don't like the MERS's own disclaimers are, don't trust any of this in court.
Right.
This is not credible evidence. We don't know if any of it's true or not. Right. So a judge here in Florida, in Miami, John Gordon, was like, this is all a sham. You told me MERS doesn't own anything, yet here's another case that you filed that says MERS owns a note and mortgage. He struck all the cases as a sham.
Right.
And wrote a beautiful order explaining this. This is like 2006,
right.
2005.
Right.
Right. And Fannie Mae's investigators go investigate, and their law firm, Baker Hostetler, their report gets published in the New York Times. It's a confidential attorney-client privilege report that says the Florida MERS embarrassment is what they called it, said the judge was right. MERS is line of judges, not just in Florida. And, the assignment of mortgage is a secured transaction. You got to go under Article 9 of the UCC. So all this stuff is happening. And what do you see next is the banks come out with these assignments of mortgages. And who are they from? MERS. And what is MERS doing? Selling the note and mortgage they don't own to the Bank of New York Mellon, which is all fraud. And they got caught because these idiots were paying people to sit in a room with a woman named Linda Green, and all these other people were signing Linda Green's signature instead of their own.
And so other signatures, it was bogus assignee was one of the most ridiculous. I mean, it was they were high school students anyway.
Garbage. It was people that were working as maids and busboys and making all of a sudden $20 an hour to sign their name 1,000 or sign someone else's name. It's forgery, is what it was.
Right. That's my point. So, I'm trying to get to that. Yes.
So all of this becomes, the Florida Attorney General's office breaks it open. Everybody knows that this is happening, and we're all watching. There was one court, the Fourth District.
Everybody in the system, but not the public. Because again, I remind you what I teed you up with. Rachel Maddow understands the documentation fraud and the electoral scheme to steal the election because it's Donald Trump, but she has never once understood the full breadth and the scope of millions of documentation fraud used by these banks, even after the national mortgage settlement, which is the point.
I have seen Bank of America. We had CBS News run a story on the 6 o'clock news, right? I had 3 women who were all victims of the same fraudulent foreclosure. My Cuban lady.
Women of color.
3 women of color. I had an elderly widow, woman was a black retired school teacher whose husband fought in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam as a fighter pilot. She paid the mortgage. She had the cashier's checks proving payment from 2010 to 2018 every month. The first judgment was vacated because Bank of America admitted, okay, yes, we have her payments. How do they get a judgment if they had her payments? They then gave the loan to a different servicer who refiled the same foreclosure using the same false evidence, and we won the trial. We had to go all the way to trial. Nobody helped this lady. We won the trial. Then the judge said, I'm recusing myself from all your cases, stuck a judgment back on this lady that says she hasn't paid since 2010. And nobody would help her. I am being disbarred by the state of Florida. The Florida bar has prosecuted me, saying I was being dishonest by saying the first judgment got vacated due to fraud. The woman testified. How is it not fraud? They got a judgment swearing that I didn't pay, and I paid. And they admitted I paid.
Right, and you had the receipts.
But it doesn't matter because the receipts only matter if you're in front of people who are following the Constitution.
There you go.
right? Or the oath. And that is the problem, is that you now have this situation where, I mean, think about how insane it is, right? Let's go back to Hugo Morales for a second. This guy, like, made good money. He had trouble, yes, whatever. He fell behind. He was told they were going to help him. They never did for years. Then they bring us in, and I had just won just filed a federal whistleblower case against Bank of America in Miami federal court. And it was, this is all fraud. These foreclosures are based on fraudulent evidence. The endorsements are forgery, the assignment's fake. They're lying about the loan boarding process. They're not even paying the documentary stamp taxes that are owed every time you increase the principal balance on a note. Those taxes pay for affordable housing across Florida, desperately needed. And these banks are simply not paying it unless they're caught.
And you've
And
got the evidence in every direction.
I mean, to me, it is clear that the 14th Amendment says you are supposed to hold these people accountable like everybody else.
Right.
Right. And the Fifth Amendment says you can't deprive people of their property without due process.
Right.
It means a fair hearing based on competent evidence before a judge who is not biased.
Which means discovery.
And all of this comes to this final, like, to me, it sets up beautifully. Like, so Hugo Morales, we file a RICO case.
Racketeering influence, corrupt organization.
Right. It is a RICO in Florida. There are predicate acts for RICO. Forgery and perjury are predicate acts. So if you could show that they're committing perjury over and over and over again to cover up forgery in all these cases, that's RICO.
Perjury
right?
means to lie about what you're doing.
Right.
That's
And
right.
forgery means to put someone's signature on a document and then present it as the true signature of that person when you know it's not.
Elementary freaking fraud. Yes.
Right. So what happens is that we have this judge, Bronwyn Miller, who was circuit court judge at the time. Now she's on the third DCA. And I know Bronwyn we were prosecutors together. She was amazing. She was smart, aggressive. She was going somewhere. You knew it, right? She's on the third DCA. That's a pretty high jump. And, our kids went to the same same school together, Jewish day school. Like, we were friends. I have her on my cell phone, right? So when I came out of the False Claims Act case, the first thing I did was I filed this. Well, before we went to the False Claims Act case, in this Morales case, I served a subpoena on a company called Source Corp. Source Corp was identified in some of Bank of America's screenshots as, like, it was, IFR endorsement review, independent foreclosure review, endorsement review. Source Corp received endorsed original note, dated all within 3 days of each other in one of my cases. I was like, who's Source Corp? Bank of America totally lies. We don't know who they're. It's a building on the campus. What nonsense. Just totally won't turn over any records, right? And meanwhile, I subpoena Source Corp. And the only thing they send me to my subpoena, which was give me everything that you have related to Bank of America, the only thing they sent me was a contract for after the date of those entries. I'm like, well, where you guys had a contract for this entry? Where's that? And they send me the contract, and it shows it's all like black and white and barely legible, but you can see they had something called the delinquent note endorsement process, which is the forgery process, right? It's a flow chart that shows we're going to take the note, we're going to endorse it, we're going to fax an image of that over to Source Corp. Source Corp's going to upload the image into our system, and then they're going to document Source Corp date endorsed received on this date.
It's literally a brute blueprint for the fraud.
They documented the fraud. They kept very meticulous records of every case they did this in across the nation.
Wow. Which means millions of cases.
Right. So I go and I subpoena them I get back just this contract, and I know that they're full of it. So in the federal case, I subpoena Source Corp again, and I get back this email from their lawyer that says, well, we've looked into it, and apparently Bank of America ordered us to do an extensive project to purge our records, which we were obligated to do. What did that mean? Excuse you? You did what? And then they give me this report that shows 1.88 billion records purged. And it started in November of 2015, which is right when I started to identify SourceCorp. And it ended a month after I served two subpoenas, one of them in the Morales case, on SourceCorp for those records. They kept purging them for another month. That's crazy, right?
1.8 billion.
1.88 billion objects of data, metadata, and encryption codes,
Oh
keys.
my God,
That's,
that they
that's
destroyed.
military grade spoliation of evidence, is what I always called it.
Yeah.
Right. So what happens is I go back, we settle the False Claims Act case. The state, the U.S. taxpayers get a very nice check. My lawyers, who were some of the top lawyers in Miami, get a very nice check. I got a very nice check. I was the actual whistleblower.
Oh, wow.
And we go back to state court in front of Bronwyn Miller. And I'm like, Judge, we're moving for sanctions now. This is February of 2018. We're moving for sanctions because you ordered Bank of New York Mellon to produce a corporate representative, testify. They didn't show. They wouldn't give us dates. They just defied your order. How is that possible? Right? And what you see is, there's a guy from the Everglades Foundation here in Florida. That's like one of the leading Everglade preservation organizations. And there's a guy named Thomas Van Lent, who was their chief scientist, who just got put in jail for 10 days because he basically was like, you guys sold out to DeSantis, and what you're doing is going to destroy the Everglades, and you're the Everglades Foundation. I won't be a part of it. And they came after him, and he supposedly destroyed evidence in violation of a court order, and he got 10 days in jail.
Oh my God.
But if you apply the law equally,
yeah,
how come the banks, Bank of America, ordered the destruction? Nobody did anything about it, right? So I'm now with Bronwyn Miller, and we're just going to war. Like, I was super happy at the time because I knew Bronwyn, and I knew she was doing it straight. She was playing it straight. She wasn't giving me favors, but she wasn't just throwing me out either, right? She was following the law. So in this Morales case, we get into this huge discovery battle, and the bank's position is, we're Bank of New York Mellon. We don't have any way of getting to Bank of America's records. I'm like, but Bank of America is the master servicer for this trust. And you guys are working together, and you're claiming that you're all privileged together for your lawyers' communications because you're all on the same team, and you're still telling us you can't get us the screenshots that I have from the other cases that you gave me? Like, what's going on here? So we take that. I fly to New York. I depose Bank of New York Mellon. We come back. They're putting in these nonsense affidavits. We don't have access to the records. It's all fake. It's all a lie. And all of this is going on. And meanwhile, like, Hugo ends up in 20. So we had filed this RICO case. Bronwyn Miller said, I'm denying a motion to dismiss this. If he proves what he's saying is true, it's RICO. I'm allowing discovery. And right after that happened, there was an offer finally that came out. Okay, we'll give you a modification. And the modification was your loan, which was 1.25 million, that you paid down yourself to 1.18 million, now is going to 1.67 million. You're going to pay another $480,000 for your house starting today, and you'll be able to get out of foreclosure. And this guy, Hugo, I remember, like, he was beside himself. The numbers are wrong. This is nonsense. How could they do this? And he was like, I'm just going to take it and pay it. I got to save my family. He had the money. He was a good businessman. He was a smart guy. He was an honest guy, but it was killing him. Like, how dare they? Right? So we're like, all right, well, we'll get back in the RICO, treble damages plus attorney's fees. Don't worry, we got this. So they dismissed the foreclosure. And then we're going after the RICO stuff. And we finally get to an evidentiary hearing with Bronwyn Miller in like August of 2018. And she writes an 8-page order talking about how this is RICO, and here's what they've done for the last years of this case. Here's all the motions that that had to be filed. Here's all the discovery that was ordered that they didn't comply with. Here's all the stories they gave that just aren't true. Here's the testimony they offered that is not credible. They've already produced these records in other cases. They're claiming they don't have access to each other's records, but they're all joining their lawyers together. They're willfully stymieing discovery, which delayed the case for years and wasted countless hours of judicial resources. That's what the order said.
My God.
Right?
Slam
And then
dunk.
and it was done, right? Done.
God, you
CNBC
got the hoop. Yeah, that's it. You got the whole thing. You're whistling
was
Dixie.
there recording it, right? And then 2 weeks later, the bank lawyer said, Judge, I want to testify. Judge said, oh, okay. And vacated the order. As if it didn't happen. None of that's true anymore. Orders vacated, poof. And then she gets a seat on the third DCA.
Oh my God. Okay,
right?
hold on a second. Before you go forward, I got to just paint this picture real quick, okay? For those who are like disbelieving what they're hearing, but yet, guys, I can promise you this is bulletproof, okay? So for those who don't fully gestate and understand what you're looking at, imagine an AI program basically projecting a picture behind Bruce. Now, when we see this picture of Bruce sitting in front of the Supreme Court, what it's suggesting to us is the law is what is supreme in this country. The law is what matters. But what we're hearing is what we would see superimposed is tall building law firms and tall building banks and a revolving door that basically elevates the judge to a higher position to do the bidding of those who actually have control of this country.
So all of that, and what ends up happening is that when she gets up to, like, right now, part of the reason why I'm being disbarred, losing my license forever in Florida,
because you've got the truth,
is because I was saying there's a problem here. This is not, like, as a lawyer, I'm telling you how any of this works. And I'm calling it out, and I'm standing up, and I believe I have a First Amendment right, because if you can't advocate for your clients and be protected by the First Amendment, who can be protected by the First Amendment?
With evidence, though. This right? Isn't so. I mean, it's just lock, stock, and
all these. So meanwhile, in the case, we had in December of 2018, I filed another motion for sanctions. They defied another court order. And realize, you defy court orders, you present false testimony to the court. The modification they gave, which increased the principal balance of the original note from 250 to 1.25 to 1.66, they're supposed to pay a tax on that. They didn't, right? These guys are getting away with whatever they want. And the only ones who could stop them are people who are not stopping them, right? And instead, they're turning on the lawyers who are fighting for their clients. And it's not just me. I want to make sure it's clear. This is a rampant problem in Florida now. There are many examples of lawyers speaking out. I have one of my lawyer for the bar represents another lawyer who's a Black civil rights lawyer who is now facing a 30-day suspension. He's been convicted of saying Black people don't get equal justice in Florida. That is punishable with your license in Florida.
Okay, here's another reality check. People, I've got evidence all over the country that I still on the sideline because I wanted to do season 2 of the con that unfortunately we couldn't get out to the people because of this co-fangled madness that not only has enveloped our courts in our country and our political process, but also the media. And that is part and parcel to why we're bringing these revelations to the people, and you have to help us spread this far and long to everyone that will understand, because to remind people where we started, the Supreme Court laid out in front of anybody who was watching how they can cherry pick and obfuscate and literally work around the law that's right in front of us based on the evidence that we saw with our own eyes. That's at the Supreme Court. This is happening all over the country with documentation records in all sorts of real estate transactions because of everything that we've laid out. But coming back to you, go ahead.
Let me just continue with the story here because it's just nuts, right? So after Bronwyn Miller goes up to the third DCA, they bring in a new judge, right? This new judge won't give me a hearing won't rule on either my motions for sanctions and contempt or the bank's motion to dismiss. Bank of America and Bank of New York Mellon moved to dismiss. The only case that we have with the Moraleses now is their RICO case. It's been going on since 2016 when the judge said, this is RICO, I'm letting it go forward, right? And it is now 2024. But in 2018, we were waiting for an answer. The bank took an appeal to the third DCA to block the discovery. The third DCA says, we're going to block discovery because their argument is litigation privilege. Think about this, right? The whole RICO case is, in this case and others, you're committing fraud on the court. Forgery, perjury, destroying evidence, backdating records, defying court orders, defying subpoenas, like attacking judges who are ruling against you, being intentional misrepresentation to courts, not just in Florida, all over the country, as far away as Hawaii, right? And what ends up happening is that the third DCA says, we're not going to address that today in this case, whether there's a litigation privilege or not, but we are going to rule that even if you grant the motion to dismiss under the litigation privilege, the Moraleses are right, you still have jurisdiction to go after the bank for sanctions for the misconduct, right? Which is, so the idea of litigation privilege in Florida is they want to make sure everyone has the right to speak in court, and you should be allowed to say whatever you want to say without worry that you're going to get in trouble, unless you're saying that things are wrong. And if you're saying the judges are great, no problem. If you're saying there's a problem with the judge. Literally, my referee in the last bar trial where they're asking for my disbarment said the problem is I'm not allowed to cross a certain line. You can't accuse a judge of committing a crime, accuse them of taking a bribe, or accuse them of doing anything for personal gain. If you do that, you're the one that loses your bar license. If you have evidence of that, you're the one that loses your bar license. That's Florida.
Say that again. Emphasize it again. Say the last part again.
In Florida, my referee, a county court judge, right, who heard all this evidence of fraud and knows that the bar has refused to prosecute a single bank lawyer for perjury, forgery, whatever it is that judges are putting in reports saying this is a problem, right? All of that is there, and the referee amends her report in my bar case, right? First, she said, there's no evidence that you introduced because you violated some pretrial order that supports any claims, which is all nonsense. And then she says, and your star lawyer who testified on your behalf that he took over I have a RICO case in Hawaii pending right now where we allege all this fraud is happening in a national class action RICO case. And the referee's position was, this is all salacious, it's all malicious, and what you're doing is dishonest. That's why you're being disbarred. And what you cannot do, and what Mr. Lewis, the lawyer who took over the RICO case in Hawaii, because Bank America used these bar proceedings to block me from representing my clients in this case that I filed and funded, the court basically says, he said that you went too far on cross-examination when you criticized Bronwyn Miller. And I looked at the transcript. There's 2 pages of cross-examination. All he testified to was, yeah, I took over the RICO case in Hawaii. There's definitely fraud happening here. There's good faith basis. And he said, yes, I filed my own petition to the U.S. Supreme Court for 12 of Jacobs's clients, including these people. And I said, there's a clear problem. The third DCA, which has issued 10 contempt charges against me personally over years, has written in orders that I am a dishonest person, right? That I lied to a trial judge in a case I wasn't even involved in at the trial level, right? All of this is evidence of bias, which puts the onus on them under the ethics rules to disqualify themselves. And I'm disbarred because apparently I'm filing frivolous motions to disqualify the court. But meanwhile, when we go back to the transcript and I show the judge, here's the transcript. He didn't say anything like what you said. And by the way, here's all the orders, like over half a dozen orders of various judges finding bad faith, outrageous misconduct, intentional efforts to defy multiple judges' court's orders, to cover up fraud, criminal contempt proceedings against the banks and their lawyers for perjury about the fraud. I mean, all of these orders that I obtained over my years of doing the work. And she had to admit, yeah, okay, that's evidence that you introduced. For sure, that's in. And meanwhile, still left the order saying Bruce is making salacious and malicious arguments. These
Unbelievable.
judges
Go
did
ahead.
this, but the worst part is now her ruling is, well, yeah, maybe Mr. Lewis didn't say what I said before, but he agreed with me because he said he would never accuse a judge of committing a crime. He would never accuse a judge of taking a bribe. He would never accuse a judge of doing something for personal gain. And my respectful response was, he's not the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court says you're required to do that. The ethics rules of lawyers, we are a self-regulating profession. We are supposed to police each other. That's in the rules. It's an ethical violation not to report that.
Right. Good point, by the way.
So meanwhile, the case sits for the
Before
morality.
you move on, I got to just make this point because again, I got to track with some kind of pop culture references here. Just if people are kind of boondoggled in their propeller lips, like, what did you just say, sort of thing? It's like, look, there's a reason we say absolute power corrupts absolutely. Just like Bastiat said in 17th century France, when a group of men discover plunder, they create a legal code to authorize it and a moral code to glorify it. What we're talking about is what I introduced at the very beginning of this conversation. Corruption births and fuels fascism. What we're looking at with this incredible, what I've seen is a formula that Donald Trump has put on display for I don't know how long, which is lie, deny, switch the blame, and implicate. When a judge says to you that you're being salacious, that you're bringing these unfair criticisms of judges, what?
Malicious.
Malicious. When you have the evidence, when you have all of the,
But they struck the evidence.
And they struck the evidence.
Let me say this, right? So the Florida Supreme Court back in June issued a ruling unanimously suspending me from the practice of law for 91 days, not 90 days. The difference is 91 days, I'm out. I have to ask to get back in.
Oh man.
It's already, I mean, I finished my suspension in October.
Yeah.
I'm not back in. They're not going to let me back in. But meanwhile, 2 weeks after my suspension order comes down, the U.S. Supreme Court enters an opinion, in this case called Counterman. And in Counterman, it was a case about threats, true threats, right? Can you prosecute a guy for making threats unless you prove that he had a subjective intent to make a threat? Because in that case, they were saying it was an objective issue, whatever the nonsense, right? And the whole discussion in the case was, well, this is very similar to the law that we've established on the defamation against public officials, right? There's this New York Times malice standard. If you are being accused of defaming a public official, like a judge, they have a burden to prove that you had a subjective intent, that you knew what you're saying was that it was false what you said and you knew it was false, or you recklessly didn't care it was false, right? That's the standard. And in Florida, they have my case says we have chosen not to follow that. The Florida Bar versus Ray is a case where they said, because we're protecting the integrity of the judiciary, we don't think that you need New York Times malice, so we're going to use an objective standard. And because you didn't objectively present any evidence that any judge was ignoring fraud on the court, you lose your license.
Oh my God. Meanwhile, by the way, Trump gets away with this every day, all day, but go ahead.
Meanwhile, they struck 13 bar complaints that I filed saying, here's everyone that's caught coaching witnesses to commit perjury, and they're admitting to it, right? Here is the 3 motions for criminal fraud contempt I wanted to file in one case, one Bank of New York Mellon case where they were lying, had the forged endorsement and false assignment case. In the case, they had the loan boarding testimony. They were coaching witnesses to commit perjury about that we want to introduce the records from the prior servicer. We're not the prior servicer. They wouldn't be admissible, except for they created a law that said, because you're swearing that we checked the records and made sure they're accurate, now they're admissible. So then we went and got them to admit, yeah, we're not checking anything. There's no check for accuracy. We just accept them.
This is
And it's nuts, right?
it's infuriating. It's infuriating. How do you maintain your sanity, man?
Because to me, this is like, this is the path. This is what why am I still here? Because I believe that there is a greater purpose to what I'm doing. And I may be wrong, right? Maybe there is no God, maybe there is no constitution, maybe there's no media, maybe there's no, one else who really, really, really wants
Maybe
to
there's
make,
no truth and justice. That's
maybe,
it.
maybe we're out, but at least I'll know that I did my part, right? I don't want to
Do
die
what you
on
can
the
do.
battle, but I'm willing to stand up for my client's constitutional rights and my rights, right? So what ends up happening is, the Moraleses, right, are waiting for years now. Hugo, who they were paying the mortgage. There was no foreclosure. There's just this RICO case. We can't get on calendar with the judge. He won't rule on anything for years, right? And then I get disbarred. I'm out. So now all of a sudden I see the judge, who was a friend of mine when we were prosecutors together 25 years ago. We used to play basketball every Saturday morning together. We used to hang out at his sister's house. Like, we were friends, right? And I go to the judge randomly out in the street. I'm at Chicken Kitchen. I'm like, Carlos, what happened? Like, why did you let the banks do this? I don't understand. Just answer me that one question. And he's like, yeah, well, that order came down from on high. What? What? Did you just say that order came down from on high? Who's high? Who's on high? Where is that? You mean the Bank of America? That high? Is that how high we're doing this? And sure enough, the next day I get an email that says, we're going to grant the motion to dismiss under the litigation privilege. Please prepare an order from the court. Right? So I'm sitting here like not able to be involved. Like, I don't have anything to do with this, right? But I reach out to my old law partner who's friends with these people, and I tell them what's going on, and now they're outraged, right? Because they destroyed 1.88 billion records in violation of subpoena in this case. They lied to the court in this case. They wasted years of fighting me about turning over screenshots that they turned over all the time. And the screenshots they finally gave me showed the forgery. Yeah, they documented the dates. It was all done years after Countrywide ceased operations.
I have to interrupt you because I've got to just insert this point. People, if you understand American history, Watergate basically paralyzed the entirety of the government of the United States to get to the bottom of the records of who did what and how, and who lied in the investigation and why, and all of these things. In comparison, and what Deep Throat created at that monumental time compared to what you're hearing from Bruce Jacobs, who's answering text while we're doing this because he's a guy just trying to live. He just revealed to us he's got 1.8 billion, 1.88 billion levels of fraud that this giant, too big to fail, systemically important financial institution that got trillions of dollars in illegal bailouts from the Federal Reserve controls the courts that will not allow truth to penetrate, to crush everything that this country stands for and actually is created to do. I mean, this isn't it's beyond outrageous, Bruce. It's beyond insane that you and I are talking to probably at maximum a group of 3,000 people. This needs to be heard by tens of millions of people. Sorry to get elevated, but this is absolutely insane because I know the demolition, the collateral damage this financial terrorism has wrought to the United States.
Well, let me say this: next week, Wednesday morning at 9:00, there's going to be a hearing in the case for the Moraleses. And what's interesting is now there's like a dream team of like just some like, I'm a very well-known lawyer in Miami, and I know a lot of really good people who are offended at what we're seeing. And there's going to be a pushback, right? Because remember, in this case, the third DCA said, even if you grant the motion to dismiss and you claim there's a litigation privilege, it's not the end of it. Still got sanctions. You got contempt powers. And that's going to be the push.
So
Right.
finally, you've got attorneys that are standing up for you in a case that involves that could. I mean, what can we do? What do we need to get people to understand? Is there things that we can activate?
Right now, what we need is someone who can get to it's just about getting into a higher audience. Look, Bank of America and Bank of New York Mellon are raising the same arguments, even worse in Hawaii, where we have this RICO case that's like everything I've ever known about foreclosure fraud is in this one case in Hawaii. The bank's argument is, oh, it's privileged. First Amendment. The First Amendment says we can do whatever we want to in court. It's litigation activity. You can't charge us for RICO. Let the state courts handle it. And meanwhile, all the Ninth Circuit law, which controls Hawaii, says no, that there's no privilege for intentional misrepresentations to courts, period. Right. And there is no way that, you're allowed to use the First Amendment to commit RICO, period. Right. And all this is there waiting for, there's going to be a hearing March 5th in federal court in front of this Judge Ataki. And, to me, it's like, how is this not yet part of a national conversation? In Israel, you had hundreds of thousands of people taking the streets in
Right.
demonstrations for months. Why? Because they wanted to change the way they pick judges. Instead of using independent commissions that would say, this guy is a great judge. He's got the right temperament. He's a smart guy. He cares. He's honest. He's integrity. He's going to hold the line true. He's going to protect the rights of the powerful and the powerless. This is the right guy, right? Which is biblical. Like having a judge, that was the first thing they did when the seas parted and the Egyptians drowned, is Miriam danced with the women and then they picked judges.
Right.
Right. So all of this is like,
amen.
It's all here, and yet you have this question in Florida. They changed the system 20 years ago to allow the governor to pick our judges. So the governor now packs the judicial nominating commissions with their loyalists, who are all Federalist Society members, and then they use that to pick whoever the judges are. And there's all these articles, right? There's former U.S. Florida Supreme Court justices calling this a perversion that threatens the rule of law. Peggy Quince wrote articles saying this because it is a perversion and the rule of law is threatened. Because think about this. If you have a judge, right, who is sworn to protect the constitutional rights of all that come before him, and the judge is not doing that, and then he says, you're not allowed to say I'm not doing that, and starts violating First Amendment rights, and that takes hold, then there is, why they say Florida is where woke goes to die? It's because the courts is where woke's supposed to live, right? What is woke?
Exactly. They strangle justice, man.
Like, this is where it all comes down to. So, I mean, look, I'm gonna fight for my clients till I can't anymore, and right now I can't, but I still got a few things in the hopper. I'm waiting to see what happens in New York because they're trying to take my license in New York, and I put it all there. This is all First Amendment retaliation, right? You can't punish a lawyer for speaking truth about his cases, even if it's offensive, right? There's U.S. Supreme Court law on this, but they're not following the U.S. Supreme Court law. Why? Because it's apparently easier and cheaper to get rid of me than it is to hold the banks accountable.
Of course.
Why is that? Like, why are we not making them pay documentary stamp taxes? The industry owes hundreds of millions of dollars to the government that's supposed to pay for affordable housing, and they're not doing it. And that's
a great point.
Hoping eventually we're going to get something done with the City of Miami's foreclosure sanctions affordable housing trust fund, but the fight goes on.
What I remind people of all the time is in 2009, 33 trillion, there's 1,000 billion in a trillion, $33 trillion was unleashed illegally to provide liquidity to these criminal apparatuses that have since bought the government and bought our courts, and we've given them another 40 trillion since. We're over $70 trillion, and that's what we're dealing with. Bruce, look, a couple of things to finish this up. I got to ask you a couple of questions, and I'm sorry you've got to answer all of these texts at the same time, but thank you for your time. So, are you telling me that in this entire conversation, just to recap, law firms and attorneys lied? They committed perjury on the court using documentation fraud. We established that, correct?
Yeah, it's forgery. They're covering up with perjury. They're destroying evidence, backdating records, defying court orders, defying subpoenas. Nobody would ever be allowed to do this. But every time someone gets close to holding them accountable, they've got friends in high places who stop it.
And then you
And
said, and then that potentially indicts judges that I'll say it. You don't have to say it, but obviously the discussion and the evidence, bears out that we're talking about potentially corrupt judges that have been making these
I think
decisions.
is more problematic than potentially corrupt judges because, yeah, there's definitely weird stuff going on in Florida, right? Like there's all kinds of documented like things that shouldn't be happening, and the all of it's being reported and nobody's doing anything about it. But one of the things that I think is a little bit nuts is the bar, right? The bar is a failsafe, right? The bar is in the Judicial Qualifications Commission, like they're supposed to make sure this doesn't happen. Because when you report anything to the bar, they have the power to step right in and stop it, right? And what's happening right now? There was an article in the Florida Bulldog about this guy Peter Tickton, who I know was a foreclosure guy years ago, and then he was like Donald Trump's high school classmate, and is a huge Trump supporter. And he and Alina Habba filed a RICO case here in South Florida about the Steele dossier, the PP tapes thing.
Right, right.
And
That's how you be talking about that. Go ahead.
the federal judge issued
Alina Habba, by the way. Go ahead.
$1 million sanction, and in the order said the bar needs to investigate this. And the reporter from the Florida Bulldog was able to show a year and a half later there's no investigation. They won't even touch this lawyer, who a federal judge said filed a totally performative lawsuit just to get clicks and attention in the media. It was false. He should be punished by the bar for that, is what the federal judge said. The bar won't touch this guy. Meanwhile, the reporter pointed out there's another guy named Daniel Ufelder, who is known as the Grim Reaper lawyer. This guy, when COVID started, and after like everything was shut down, DeSantis opened the beaches, and this guy showed up on the beach wearing a Grim Reaper costume to make a point. You're all going to die because you're here on the beach. There's COVID. Get back in your house. So he filed a lawsuit in North Florida, and the trial judge said, "I understand what you're doing. I know you believe it in good faith, but I'm not going to grant. I'm going to dismiss the case. I encourage you, take an appeal. I'm not going to tell DeSantis he has to stop." So the guy took an appeal, and what happened to this guy in the first DCA is what happened to me in the fourth DCA. They denied him. They said it was all frivolous. They hit him not only with like a bar complaint, but they hit him with criminal contempt. And they even ordered the prosecutor, the state attorney's office, to start criminal contempt proceedings against this lawyer, who is now being prosecuted by the bar for his speech. Right. And if you are a Trump guy in Florida, they won't touch you. If you are a Democrat saying DeSantis is wrong, they'll burn you at the stake. And the bar has to decide which one they're doing it. And that's not the only one, right? I told you about my lawyer represents 4 different lawyers who all raise the same First Amendment argument. How do you prosecute a guy for making frivolous arguments when he won his first foreclosure trial saying there's fraud? It's not frivolous. You could say whatever you want, but not a single judge except for the bar referee judge ever said it was frivolous. Now this guy's looking at a 6-month suspension, right? And the black civil rights lawyers, like imagine you are a black civil rights lawyer. You are frustrated that you know that they're not treating your cases correctly. It's impossible. You win a $2 point something million judgment, jury verdict. And then the judge says, I'm entering judgment for the bank or for the hospital, right? And all of a sudden now,
you know that that's wrong, and you go out and say, there's a problem here. These people are not, they're not following the law. Black people are not getting equal justice in Florida. And he brought a University of Florida law professor to the bar trial to explain why that's true with data points. And yet he's convicted, and now he's facing a 30-day suspension. Right. And then you have these other judges who are, referees. Like one referee was like, I'm entering judgment in favor of the lawyer because the bar didn't do any investigation. And had they did, they would have seen the lawyer did nothing wrong. And by the way, the bar also defied a court order by lying about discovery, which is what they did for me too. And then you have another guy, two lawyers going after powerful former federal prosecutors and kicking their butts until all of a sudden the bar comes in and goes after the two lawyers saying what they're saying is frivolous. One lawyer gets disbarred. The other lawyer, on the same evidence, was found not guilty. And the judge said, here's 50 pages of why what he said was totally legitimate. Right? And there was even a referee who wrote in his report, the Florida bar prosecutor, John Womack, by name the guy, chose the side of the insurance industry, which led to unethical problems in the case. There is a real problem when you have, it's called capture, right?
Right.
If you,
right.
Thomas Jefferson famously said, one day these banks are more dangerous than standing armies. One day they'll leave us homeless and penniless in the nation our fathers founded. We're at that day. It's happening now. If you haven't noticed how many houses are being sold to Wall Street investors who are now going to rent them to us, it's horrible.
Who get free money from the Fed illegally, which is the ultimate point. But look, corruption burns and fuels fascism is the point, and the revolving door is what we just described earlier. And look, the bottom line is that the United States government is demonstrating. And if you watch MSNBC, for example, every night they superimpose and imprint and rebrand and echo chamber and everything else along these lines. Donald Trump is facing 91 indictments through a myriad of scenarios. But what the shortcut is he defrauded the United States using misrepresentation, basically to use documentation fraud to an electoral scheme to illegally steal the election. Hold on, let me finish this.
Let me just jump in 1 second, all right? Most of my New York stuff for the bar that says it's all First Amendment, you see Trump, Giuliani, all these people that are raising the same, they're all being slapped down, and it's the same law that I'm citing for why I'm supposed to be protected.
Right.
It is the inverse situation.
There you go. But it's insane because moving forward, though, this is my point, because beyond that, and I hear this from Lawrence Tribe every night on Lawrence O'Donnell, and I'm trying to get Lawrence Tribe's attention on your case and everything else that we've got. And ultimately, you have exemplified that not only that they're also revealing that through the criminal fraud exception, and this is through Jack Smith's investigation in your state in Florida that involves attorneys that are relying on behalf of Trump, and then also a judge that is kicking the can, which is Eileen Cannon, which is where you were talking about Haba, for example. But all of the elements that the government of the United States is demonstrating is illegal, that Donald Trump is guilty of. What I continue to reveal to the American people is, yes, but he's a tiny piece of what Bruce is revealing to us. What he did, as large as it is, and is seemingly like mind-boggling, is nothing compared to the tens of millions of pieces of documentation fraud used in these cases to literally wipe out tens of millions of people that led to tens of trillions of dollars being unleashed illegally by the full faith and credit of the United States to the system that has complete control.
Look, I love it. I'm glad that we're able to talk about it. I pray that there is a path that people look. There is a very, very, very small segment of the population that has all of the money and power, and they are using it to capture the government, right? And all of us are fighting each other instead of fighting them, and the system is breaking down. And by design. I don't believe that it's a red versus white right thing. I
Blue.
think it red versus blue. I think it is rich versus poor, as it's always been. And when I say rich, I don't mean people that have $1 million in the bank, or even 10 million, or even 100 million
Millions.
in the bank, right? Like, you're not part of the club.
Yep.
That there's not supposed to be a club, but there always was, and there always will be. And particularly if we don't stop it now, it's coming. And so let me do this,
It's
Patrick.
here.
I appreciate you taking the time with me and giving me this platform. I love talking to you about all the stuff. You know, you are a true warrior in the sense too.
Right
And
back at you.
very, very happy and grateful. But I got my phone is blowing up here because my son
Absolutely.
is out. But I love you to death, and
I love
wish
you to death.
well. And let if there's more to talk about, let me know. I'm here for you.
Yeah, we'll continue the conversation. Thank you so much, and all the best. Please, people, spread this far and wide. All the best. Bruce Jacobs from Florida. We'll be in touch, my friend.
God bless. Bye bye.